In the long, breathless silence of medieval Europe, when night stretched endlessly and the land itself seemed to hold its breath beneath heavy clouds, a quiet catastrophe began to unfold. Unnoticed at first, because it arrived not with armies or flames, but with rain. Soft at the beginning, almost gentle, falling steadily upon the fields in the year 1315, soaking the earth until the soil turned heavy and airless, and farmers, who had lived their entire lives by the rhythm of seasons, sensed that something was wrong, though they could not yet name it, because spring brought no warmth, only cold winds and endless moisture, and seeds planted with hope simply dissolved into mud before they could rise, while summer followed, without sun leaving crops pale stunted and rotting where they stood, and across villages scattered from England to France, from the Low Countries to the German lands, people waited patiently at first, believing the skies would eventually clear, because they always had before, yet this time the rain did not stop, and with each passing week the familiar certainty of bread began to fade slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day loaves grew smaller, prices crept higher, and the quiet fear of hunger settled into daily life. And this was the beginning of what history would later call the Great Famine of Europe, a disaster that unfolded slowly enough to feel unreal, yet relentlessly enough to break an entire civilization, because medieval Europe was already stretched thin, its population larger than ever before, its lands cultivated to their absolute limits, every marginal field pressed into service, leaving no room for failure, no surplus to fall back on when nature turned cruel. And so when harvests failed again and again, not once, but repeatedly over several years, the foundations of society began to crack. Though from the outside life seemed to continue, church bells still rang, markets still opened, and kings still ruled, yet beneath the surface hunger gnawed at bodies and minds alike, weakening not only individuals, but the fragile systems that held communities together. And as the rain persisted into 1316, livestock began to suffer alongside people, grazing lands transformed into thick mud where animals slipped, starved, and fell ill, while disease spread rapidly among cattle and sheep, reducing herds that had taken generations to build, and milk dried up, meat vanished from tables, and the few animals that survived were too weak to provide sustenance, forcing people to rely almost entirely on grain that no longer existed. And in towns and cities the impact was swift and brutal, because urban populations depended completely on rural harvests, and when those harvests failed, grain merchants raised prices beyond the reach of ordinary people, turning bread into a luxury reserved for the wealthy, while the poor watched helplessly as food slipped further and further out of reach, and authorities attempted to impose price controls and regulations Yet these measures collapsed under the weight of desperation, because laws mean little to empty stomachs, and soon markets became places of tension and fear rather than trade, as crowds gathered not to buy but to beg, argue, and sometimes riot. While in the countryside, entire villages began to empty, families abandoning their homes in search of food that did not exist, walking along muddy roads lined with others just like them then, silent figures moving without destination, and many never reached another village or town, collapsing instead in forests, fields, or ditches, their deaths unrecorded, their names forgotten, swallowed by the landscape itself. And hunger did not kill swiftly, it lingered, stretching suffering across months and years, stripping away strength gradually, weakening immune systems until even the smallest illness became fatal. A simple fever turning deadly, a minor wound refusing to heal, and children were among the most vulnerable, their bodies unable to endure prolonged deprivation, and parents watched helplessly as sons and daughters grew thinner, quieter, their energy fading day by day, until eventually they stopped crying altogether, leaving behind a silence more painful than sound. And burial practices changed as death became too common to honor properly. Churchyards filled beyond capacity, mass graves were dug hurriedly, and bodies were laid to rest without ceremony, because grief itself had become overwhelming, an unbearable constant rather than an exception, and medieval chroniclers, hardened by violence and hardship, struggled to describe the horrors they witnessed, writing of people eating cats, dogs, horses, and rats, animals once considered unthinkable as food, and in the most desperate cases, whispers spread of cannibalism, particularly among the poorest and most isolated communities. Though whether all such stories were true matters less than the fact that people believed them, because hunger reshaped morality itself, erasing boundaries that had once seemed absolute. And this famine struck indiscriminately, sparing neither peasants nor nobles entirely, because although the wealthy fared better, even they felt the strain as rents, when unpaid revenues collapsed and authority weakened, while kings found themselves unable to command food into existence, revealing the limits of power in the face of environmental disaster. And as hunger deepened, faith itself was tested. Churches filled with desperate prayers, processions wound through rain-soaked streets, and people begged God for mercy, yet the skies remained dark, and when relief did not come, reactions diverged sharply. Some turned toward extreme piety, convinced the famine was divine punishment, while others turned away from faith, entirely believing the world had been abandoned. And this spiritual fracture quietly altered medieval society, planting seeds of doubt that would continue to grow long after the famine ended. And by 1317, the relentless rain finally began to ease. But the damage was irreversible, because seed reserves had been consumed till sold animals lost, and countless farmers were either dead or too weak to work the land, meaning recovery was agonizingly slow, stretching on for years, with food shortages continuing well into the following decade. And historians estimate that between 10 and 15% of Europe's population perished during the Great Famine. Millions of lives last not in a single dramatic moment, but through prolonged deprivation. And those who survived carried the famine within them, their bodies weakened, their resistance to disease diminished, unknowingly preparing the ground for the arrival of the Black Death in 1347, which would find a population already exhausted, already vulnerable. And as medieval Europe slowly moved forward, the memory of the famine faded from collective consciousness, overshadowed by the horror of the plague, yet its effects lingered silently, reshaping demographics, economies, and beliefs, leaving abandoned villages to be reclaimed by forests, bones buried beneath fields, and a quiet lesson written into history itself, that even the greatest civilizations rest on fragile foundations, vulnerable to forces as simple as rain and cold. And now, as you lie still and listen, far removed from that distant century, allow the echoes of that hunger to soften and drift away, leaving only the calm understanding that survival itself is an act of endurance, repeated quietly across generations, breath by breath, night after night.